All right, it's 6:03. Let's go ahead and get started. My name is Katie Glenn. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a policy associate here at the SPLC Action Fund in Montgomery. I want to say thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're so glad to have you here. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping real quick before we really jump into things and get started. So just a heads up, the meeting is being recorded. We will share it out with all of our attendees for tonight. So although you can't really come on video or say anything in the chat box, did want to give everyone that heads up. And also, if there's any information that you don't quite catch, you can always watch it in the recording. In addition, if you do have questions throughout the course of our presentation, there is a little box at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. Please drop your questions into that Q&A box. We will come back to them at the end of the evening. So with that, I introduce myself quickly. I'm going to allow my colleague Jerome to come on, or ask him to come on and introduce himself, and then we'll get started.
Good evening, everybody. And again, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Jerome Dees. My pronouns are he, him, his. Just a brief introduction background on myself. Before joining SPLC 2 months ago, I worked as a prosecutor, and then as a public defender, then as a criminal rights, civil rights attorney, and then finally as an immigration attorney before finally landing here at SPLC. So I'm incredibly thrilled to be joining Katie in the work that she's been doing and to continue to uplift the issues and problems here in our state that you attendees are just so fervent about.
Thanks, Jerome. We are so excited to have Jerome on our team. If you all know Shay Farley, who's been leading our Alabama SPLC policy work for some time, she's not gone. She's just leading all of our state level policy work. And so may not be always on these webinars, but she's still around. So I'm going to kick us off with a little bit of setting the stage for what's about to happen in January, what we expect. And then after that, we will go through each of our legislative priority areas and talk to you a little bit about what we plan to work on, wrap up, and like I said, save some time in the end for Q&A. So if you're here tonight, you probably already know the importance of engaging with the state legislature. So I certainly will not preach at you about that, but do want to go over sort of what's going to happen when the session starts. Because this is the fourth year of the quadrennium, so the fourth year of a legislative term, election year, legislative session will start on Tuesday, January 11th. Just like every other legislative session, it can run 30 legislative days. So that's a day that they're on the floor taking votes or debating bills, et cetera. Can run 30 legislative days within 105 calendar days, which puts us from January 11th to it's either April 24th or 25th, whatever that Monday is. Although a session can certainly run shorter than that, once they've passed both budgets, the Education Trust Fund budget and the General Fund budget, legislators can go home. That's the only thing they're constitutionally required to do. But as 2022 is an election year, there are a few things that we can predict. Lots of folks are predicting that this will be a relatively short session. The last election year, so legislative session of 2018, they wrapped up in late March. Doesn't mean that'll happen this year, but it might. So folks are expecting that this will be a quick and action-packed session filled with election year bills. That is pay raises for state employees, support for popular programs, lots of so-called red meat issues. We'll get to those here in a little bit. But what's most important to know is that the decisions made by your legislators here in Montgomery impact your everyday life. That's everything from the taxes you pay, the schools that are in your communities, the courts that you have to go to, the roads you drive on, all of that is touched by the state legislature. And although actions that take place in Congress at the federal level get a whole lot of attention, sometimes they take a little while to trickle down to you, right? But what happens here in Montgomery at the legislature will impact you pretty immediately. Legislators spend a lot of time with people like me and Jerome, so people who are paid to lobby for an organization or an issue on or a specific entity, and even more time with people who send their campaigns lots of money, some of whom are lobbyists, some of whom aren't. But the people who matter most to them at the end of the day are you, their constituents. We can tell them what to do on a bill, but we can't bring them back to Montgomery every 4 years. That's what only you can do. And though it sometimes might not feel like it, legislators really do care about what their constituents think. We've seen several bills over the course of the last few years that, were it not for public input and public opinion, might not have made it onto their legislators' top priority lists. You might remember the midwives bill from session 2017, I think that was, or the autism insurance bill from several sessions ago. Those were issues that legislators maybe didn't know a whole lot about going into session, but because of the determined nature of their constituents, because of all the feedback that they got, they became really big legislation that folks who might have been unexpected ended up championing. In fact, last year, because of public support, we were able to pass several pieces of really important legislation. That includes reforming Alabama's homophobic sex ed laws, requiring transparency in data and reporting from the Alabama Department of Corrections, and a bill that Jerome has worked on for many years, which was civil asset forfeiture reform, where we were able to greatly reduce law enforcement's ability to seize private property from people before they're even convicted of a crime. So now that we've talked a little bit about what to expect in 2022, we're going to talk to you about the actual issues that we're going to be working on. So Jerome is going to kick us off with our first two. Jerome?
All right, so let's jump right into it. The first issue that we'll really be paying attention to is the issue of due process, and specifically due process in the context of students' rights. Shatara Pelton, who's mother of a student in the Pike County area, so down near Troy, her son was falsely accused of smoking marijuana outside of his high school and was ultimately suspended from his school. He ended up missing close to about 3 months, and it severely affected his ability to progress in that school system. Ultimately, he was cleared of that. One of the things that we'll be working hard on this upcoming session, as I said, is due process for students, specifically a due process bill that will create a statewide procedure and protocol by which the school system will hear and address whatever concerns are brought in the school setting. This legislation, which we expect to be brought in the Senate by Senator Smitherman, will lay out specific guidelines, such as requiring schools or school boards to give notice to the students and their parents of exactly what the allegations are, the time and place of the hearing, allowing students to bring advocates on their behalf, just so that way they can have their fair say and their fair shot at defending themselves against those allegations. One of the reasons that implementing these protections is so important is because what we see across the state is a significant racial disparity in how suspensions and expulsions are divvied out. Students of color, we see, often bear the brunt at a significant rate compared to their white counterparts. And the state of Alabama is the only state in the entire Southeast that does not provide due process protections to students. And so that's going to be one of the significant pieces of legislation that we're actively working on right now, and we'll keep a very close eye on once session begins in January. It's important to also know regarding that there's a great deal of bipartisan support that's around that, so we're incredibly hopeful for that, as well as support from some of our local prosecutors, particularly up here in Jefferson County. And that's largely because whether you are liberal or conservative, Republican or Democrat, everybody kind of understands the importance of making sure that our students, number one, are able to stay in school and get the learning and training that they need and don't fall so far behind. And two, just the general concept of due process, that everyone gets the opportunity to have their say, share their side of the story, and be heard. The next large area that we'll be addressing is in the criminal legal reform area. I'm going to back up and kind of give a little bit of context. The first thing that we'll be addressing is parole guidelines and parole reform. So in 2012, almost a decade ago, the Alabama State Legislature, along with the Alabama Sentencing Commission, largely in an effort to address the prison overpopulation, prison crowding that so many of us are aware of at this particular juncture, passed what were called the Presumptive and Voluntary Sentencing Guidelines. Now, this is something that in my previous life as a prosecutor, I dealt with on a daily basis. So in essence, what these guidelines did is they laid out exactly the framework and the parameter by which what sentences for crimes could be offered and imposed against criminal defendants. And so it's literally on a sheet of paper that we would get. And the criteria that would be laid out would include things like the seriousness of the offense, the number of prior felony convictions that the individual may have received, the number of prior convictions for misdemeanors, things like whether you'd served more than 1 year in jail previous, or more than 1 year in prison previously, or less than a year, if there were any prior juvenile delinquencies. So all of these different types of factors were taken into account. And so you would take that sheet, you mark a check, and there are points next to each consideration. And at the bottom of the sheet, you would tally all that up and open up a book. And at the back of that book, there's a full chart that lists out the corresponding number and the amount of time that would be offered to that criminal defendant based on the charge and all of that preceding information. That information would not only dictate the length of time, but what's called prison disposition, which means whether you would get an in or an out recommendation. In being you actually have to serve time under Alabama Department of Corrections custody, or out disposition, where you did not have to serve time in prison. I give all of that information to say that when we look at what the Alabama Board of Pardon and Parole has at their disposal presently, and what they can do, there are already tools in place for us to address, for lack of a better term, the train wreck that we're seeing as far as prison overcrowding and prison overpopulation with respect to the number of individuals that are applying for and being rejected for pardons and paroles here in Alabama. Just a few years ago, guidelines were created for the Board of Pardon and Parole to consider when individuals would apply for their pardons and paroles. And what we're seeing from top to bottom is that they largely are not following those guidelines. To give you just a few statistics to see just how egregious and how bad the situation is here in Alabama. The rate of parole grantees here in Alabama has dropped to 15%, and that's 3 straight years of decline. A little broader context, there are over 4,000 inmates here in Alabama that applied, were eligible and applied for pardon or parole, or excuse me, just parole. Of those over 4,000, it was about 4,100, only 648 of those individuals were granted parole. Of the 76% of the individuals who were eligible, only 39% were granted parole. The figures for those who are granted pardon are just as bad. Only 27% of the inmates here in Alabama that are eligible are granted parole. And that's actually dropped from about 79% 2 years earlier. And similarly to what we see in the due process student rights sector, similar to what we see in the parole sector, those decisions are not just arbitrary, but we're seeing a significant racial disparity in those as well. And so one of the issues or pieces of legislation rather that we're looking towards is a bill that's actually being put out by a Republican legislator that will make those guidelines that the Board of Pardon and Parole already has at their disposal, make those guidelines presumptive. And what that means is when an inmate presents their application for pardon or for parole, once the board goes through, similar to what I did as a prosecutor, checks off all of the criteria and background, whether that individual is a risk for public safety, whether they've participated in any programs while they've been incarcerated, all of those things that are taken into account. Once they fill out that checklist and those guidelines, if they score, believe the scale is on a 0 to 7, if they score within those numbers, then the board would be required to release them either on pardon or parole. If they did not release them on pardon or parole, they would then be required to give some sort of justification or reasoning behind their departure from the guidelines, as opposed to just an arbitrary no and sending that individual off. And so having that type of framework and those guidelines and those protections would be incredibly important for a number of reasons. One, as we know, 2 special sessions ago now, our prisons are ridiculously overpopulated, and as opposed to addressing that issue through common sense, straightforward reforms, we've decided to spend billions of dollars on constructing new prisons. This bill would go a long ways towards addressing those concerns. And secondly, as I've stated multiple times now, giving inmates and the general public that information of how exactly are you making these decisions? What are the determining factors in whether or not an individual is going to be released or be required to continue to spend the rest of their life in prison, or at least a significant more amount of time in prison. Are there any racial disparities there? What is the justification behind that? And so again, this legislation would help clear up some of that. In that same vein, in the past several years, Representative Chris England out of Tuscaloosa has put forward a bill to repeal the HFOA. And the HFOA is the Habitual Felony Offender Act. And what that statute has done, or as many people know it, a 3 strikes law, has kept inmates in prison for significantly longer periods of time than just about any other state. Alabama, aside from maybe Mississippi, has the harshest 3 strikes law on the books. And so what repealing HFOA would do is allow circuit judges the discretion to go back and look at prior convictions and determine whether or not individuals would be eligible earlier for pardon and parole, reduce some of those sentences that are so incredibly onerous. And kind of as a talking point, if individuals bring up public safety concerns or things of that nature to you as you're talking with friends, colleagues, or contacting your legislators. It's important to understand that the HFOA would not immediately release every single individual. And looking forward, repealing HFOA would not necessarily mean that prosecutors don't have the necessary tools to ensure that we live in safe communities. Those guidelines, the sentencing guidelines that I keep referring back to, still allow for strict, harsh sentencing, potentially harsher than the I care for. But again, that tool is there for violent offenses if a prosecutor so chooses to lean on the stricter side. And so there are no true, genuine public safety concerns that need to be raised by repealing the Habitual Felony Offender Act. And so that's just kind of a quick, brief overview of a couple of the issues that we'll be closely monitoring or actively engaging in this upcoming legislative session. Again, just a quick recap of those under the umbrella of children's rights, students' rights, working hard on ensuring that the hearing process for students that have been accused of any sort of wrongdoing in the school context, that they have the ability to receive notice of exactly what it is that they've been charged with, and have the ability to speak up and defend themselves in an adequate manner, and in the criminal justice context, addressing parole and reform, making those guidelines presumptive, so that way we're able to hold on the Board of Pardon and Parole accountable and help reduce our prison population, as well as repealing the Habitual Felony Offender Act for a lot of those same concerns. So with that, I will turn it back over to Katie.
Thanks, Jerome. So I'm going to go over a couple other areas that we're going to be working on this legislative session, and then we will do a quick recap, and then we'll take some time for Q&A. So the first area that I want to talk to you all about is voting rights. So this issue is one that's incredibly important. It's one that it has really been in the news for the last year and a half, 2 years or so. And one that, because of the lack of action on the federal level, we continue to struggle with on the state level. So last year, we saw orchestrated attacks on voting rights across the country, though places like Texas and Georgia got the most media attention. This was happening in state houses all over the place. In Alabama, we already have many of the restrictions on voting rights that were passed in the Texas Omnibus Bill or that were part of SB 202 in Georgia. That doesn't mean that legislators didn't try to take the time to figure out new ways, to decrease civic participation. So last legislative session, there were 2 bills that were passed in an attempt to combat so-called voter fraud, an issue that we know is incredibly rare and nearly non-existent here in the state of Alabama. But those 2 bills were first sponsored by Senator Dan Roberts and Representative Wes Allen, a ban on curbside voting. There's not curbside voting in Alabama, have not been documented cases of curbside voting in Alabama. However, the reason it's important to have that available is that it provides an alternate opportunity for people with disabilities, people who are blind or have low vision, or people who are just unstable on their feet, right, have mobility disabilities, to be able to go and vote at their election place on election day. Folks should have that option. They should not be limited to absentee voting just because the state of Alabama doesn't want to provide those opportunities. And although hypothetically, all polling places in Alabama have to be ADA accessible, we provided legislators with a multitude of examples of inaccessible polling places, thanks to our partnership with the good folks over at LDF, we had worked with in 2020 on election protection work on election day, poll monitoring. We had photos, we had examples, but unfortunately it just wasn't quite enough. And that bill passed, literally in the final hours of legislative session on the last day on May 17th. In addition to that, Alabama also passed a prohibition on something that is already illegal, which we really like to do, which is voting twice in the same election. This was a bill that was sponsored by Senator Clay Schofield and Representative Blackshear. Once again, this was addressing a non-existent issue. It's not something that happens. People don't almost ever, but certainly not very frequently, attempt to vote twice in the same election. This was yet another solution without a problem that passed. And again, that was already illegal. Those were not the only attacks or attempted attacks that we saw on voting rights. Those were the two that passed. Unfortunately, last year, we had a really great coalition of folks working on some proactive legislative work around voting rights, to include a really great big concerted push for no excuse absentee voting. In Alabama, if you go to vote absentee, you have to swear out an affidavit that one of these various excuses that are listed qualify you to vote absentee. But in 2020, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Secretary of State made a special rule that said, if you were concerned about COVID-19, you could vote absentee. So basically anyone could vote absentee, and the process worked. People were able to successfully vote in advance of Election Day via an absentee ballot, either one that they sought via mail or one that they went and picked up in person at typically the local courthouse. However, after Representative Laura Hall worked very closely with the Secretary of State's office, once the Secretary of State received some pushback from someone that he thought might be his opponent in a Senate campaign that never came to fruition, Mo Brooks, he withdrew his support and that bill sort of fell apart, which was a real shame because it was a chance to continue on the very good successes of 2020. So looking ahead to 2022, what do we plan to work on? I don't know that I can tell you what the attacks on voting are going to be. There was a bill filed just today that I haven't read yet by Representative Wes Allen. However, we know that those will come. But a couple of the proactive areas that we plan to work on, we are hopeful that we can work once again with the bill sponsors on issues like no excuse absentee or early voting in Alabama to try to get some movement there. I will be honest with you that in an election year, expanding access to the ballot box is not a popular issue and might be difficult for us, but we will certainly do our very best. We're also working with our Voting Rights Coalition, the Alabama Voting Rights Coalition is its name, on a more focused strategy around the issue of voting rights restoration. So in Alabama, there are certain convictions that permanently bar you from access to voting. And then there are other convictions that once you have served the entirety of your sentence and paid off your fines and fees, you once again can get your voting rights restored. They're rescinded once you have that conviction, and they can be restored. The problem with that system, one of the many problems with that system, is first of all, the fines and fees that people are assessed as part of the conviction process for many people are just simply insurmountable. A marijuana trafficking conviction often comes with a $25,000 fine. People are assessed court fees as well. And so even after they have served their time of incarceration, they're unable to exercise their full rights as a United States citizen. Even more for people who have served the entirety of their sentence, have paid off all their fines and fees, it's not an automatic restoration process. People have to go through a pretty onerous process called SERVE. It's the Certificate of Eligibility for the Right to Vote, I think is what it stands for. I always get that R confused, but you have to go through this relatively onerous process. It has to go through several layers of bureaucracy, including your local county clerk and the Alabama Bureau of Pardons and Paroles. And so there are many ways that we're interested in cleaning up that process to allow people to, like I said, exercise their full rights as a United States citizen. And we continue to work with Representative Laura Hall and Senator Linda Coleman Madison and the entirety of our coalition on that topic as well. This will likely be a big year to talk about voting rights and voting rights restoration. And we're hopeful that we might be able to get some traction. Similarly to the attacks on voting rights, there are several areas of defensive work that we anticipate working on once again in 2022. Like I mentioned, it is an election year, and oftentimes in election years, legislators like to sponsor bills that sound good in a stump speech to their base. So although we can never fully predict what's going to take up our time, I never thought 2 legislative sessions in a row I'd be spending hours and hours and hours on bail, but we did. We'll see what comes this year, but there are 3 areas that we're pretty sure we can know we'll be working on this session. The first is attacks on trans children and their medical care. Much like voting rights, last year we saw coordinated attacks across the country to deny trans children access to the evidence-based gender-affirming care that they need, as well as to exclude them from participating in sports that align with their gender identity. You may remember that Alabama passed a sports ban last session, so we don't anticipate seeing that again this year. However, the bill that would deny kids medical care has already been refiled by Senator Shay Shelvet. I'm sure that many of you saw the coverage last year of parents and doctors and teachers and school counselors and trans kids talking about the importance of having access to this care, because the bill that was filed in Alabama didn't just make providing that care a felony. It also required that school administrators, teachers, school counselors, people that kids should trust, essentially out kids to their parents if a child confided in them about their gender identity. There was a really large and diverse group of people opposing that bill. I'm sure some of you even saw coverage of folks like Officer David Fuller from Hokes Bluff, Alabama. He's a police officer from Hokes Bluff, whose daughter, Jess, who is wonderful, came out to him as trans when she was a teenager. And he spoke very openly and candidly with legislators about what it was like for him, what the learning process was like for him, right? And the high level of care that he and his family and Jess received from the professionals who they sought out, the counselors, the psychologists, and the doctors. There are some really beautiful interviews with Jess that you can find online where she and her dad talk about their relationship and what that whole process was like for them. And it was folks like Officer Fuller and Jess, the School Counselors Association, the School Psychologists Association, grassroots organizations like the Knights and Orchids Society out of Selma, TKO, who some of you may know, who came together and were a real force of nature last session. And although this bill tried to rear its ugly head several times, it failed on the final day. It's on the final calendar on the final day, but the bill failed to ever come up. And although that was a real win, it was an incredibly difficult session for trans and non-binary kids and their families and people who love them. And unfortunately, we see that same bill back again, a piece of legislation that is not only unnecessary, but is a pretty obvious political ploy to churn up the base at the expense of children, which is really a shame. Similarly, you'll hear a theme here, coordinated effort we saw across the country, same bill in multiple locations basically, was attacks on voting rights. So after George Floyd was murdered by a police officer in Minneapolis last year, we saw protests that sprung up around racial justice and the rights of Black people, and against police brutality across the country. In response, legislators in many state houses, including our own, drafted legislation that would crack down on voting rights and that would take away people's First Amendment rights to express themselves. We know the importance of protests in the state of Alabama. This is a place that has been shaped by protest movements and by people being willing to put themselves on the line in that way. And yet it seems that many of our legislators have forgotten our history here. Perhaps they remember our history a little bit too well. But just like in neighboring states in Alabama, we saw this bill last year, and it has been refiled by bill sponsors in the House and Senate again. Representative Alan Treadway from Birmingham and Senator Shay Shelnutt, same Shay Shelnutt that I mentioned a moment ago, are sponsoring this legislation. What it would do is several things. It would increase criminal penalties for protesting. It would allow protesters to be assessed fines based on damage done during an event that they had nothing to do with. It would make it much easier for people to be arrested at protest events, and could even hold local elected officials or municipal employees, county and municipal employees, criminally and financially liable for any damage or harm to an individual that occurred during a protest. You may recall that Representative Marika Coleman gave a really beautiful and impassioned speech from the well about this last year, specifically about the legacy of protest in Alabama. She invoked the images of the Bloody Sunday in Selma. It was just very shortly after the Selma Bridge crossing and anniversary celebration that this bill came to the House floor, and talked about how it was clear that this was not related to public safety. As Jerome mentioned earlier, that's often an excuse that's used, but this bill has nothing to do with public safety. Instead, it has to do with taking away people's right to protest. Again, we were successful last year thanks to some really great legislative allies, Representative Coleman, Representative England, and Senator Smitherman especially. And we're hopeful we're able to do away with this bill again this year. And then finally, the other piece of defensive legislation that we anticipate will be no surprise to you all, I'm sure, which is attacks on inclusive education. Once again, following the murder of George Floyd and other Black men and Black women across the country by police officers, there's been an increased attempt to highlight for people the importance of teaching accurate history. This is something that's really close to our hearts here at the SPLC Action Fund and our partners at Learning for Justice, who some of you may know as Teaching Tolerance. They have got a new name, but we know that it is important to grapple with and learn our real history here in Alabama and across the country. However, a certain segment of the conservative movement has decided that calling out the teaching of so-called critical race theory is the new dog whistle this year, and we've already seen bills filed to this effect. You may be from Mountain Brook, or you may have read about in the news how this issue really started percolating in Alabama and Mountain Brook earlier this year in the spring. There was a resolution passed about so-called divisive issues by the State Board of Education, the teaching of divisive issues. But there, like I said, 3 bills that have been filed, some of which have some pretty severe implications, including the whole-scale firing of teachers in the Alabama legislature. We'll see if this is an issue that legislators really want to grapple with. We know that teachers know what's best for their classroom, not legislators in Montgomery. I certainly don't want legislators in Montgomery telling my community schools what they should be doing and how they should be teaching. And we'll see whether or not this is an issue that they really decide that they want to bring to the forefront. This is one of those election year issues, and it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. And with that, we are coming close to the end. So I see we already have a couple, but if you could start putting your questions in the Q&A box here at the bottom of the screen, or if you want to just send them to me in the chat box, you can do that too. But I'm going to turn it over to Jerome for what you can do this session, and then we'll go to Q&A.
So we've just given you all of this information on all of these different topics and issues that we kind of anticipate seeing in the coming months for the 2022 legislative session. So with that, what do you do? One of the first things that you can do is log on to the internet, go to Secretary of State's website and check and see exactly who your representatives are. Find your polling place, who your state senator is, who your state representatives are, who your school board members are. Find that information and contact them. If there's something in particular that we've discussed this evening that really tugs at your heartstrings, is something that is deeply important and personal to you, contact them and let them know. As Katie said at the outset, they really do respond to constituent calls and emails, things of that nature. So again, if there's something that's been said, some issue that's of importance to you, go on to that webpage and we can provide that information afterwards. But contact your local public officials and let them know what's important to you. Secondly, follow along and see the updates that we provide for you all leading up to session and throughout session. It will be in addition to the work that we do in the State House. One of the things that we'll be working hard to do is keep you up to date and apprised of exactly what's going on. To understand that many of us have jobs that don't allow us to be at the state capitol every single day and know what's going on. It's our job to make sure that you're aware of what's happening so that way you can contact the necessary officials. And so we'll make sure to keep you apprised and up to date as best we can of what's going on. And again, we are here as a resource for you, but let us know the things that matter most to you as well, so that way we can continue to fight for and represent those issues that will continue to move Alabama forward. So again, one, find out who your representatives are, touch base with them, log on, follow us, see what issues we're working on, what progress is being made on those, what divisive, bad legislation we're working to stop, and reach out to us and let us know what things we can continue to do to push those issues forward. I believe with that, we can open it up to questions and answers. Katie?
Yeah, so we've already got one question from Frank in the chat, which was a couple of years ago. Shay, who I mentioned earlier, both when she was at SPLC and when she was previously at Alabama Appleseed, had worked with Senator Cam Ward on a bill to reform Alabama's Open Records Act. Senator Ward is no longer a senator. He's now the director of the Alabama Bureau of Pardons and Paroles. And Frank was wondering if we're going to work on this issue. So the last several years, we have supported this bill and helped to try to get it moving. And it's been really difficult. So Alabama's open records law, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, is basically toothless. If I call my local city council and I say, I want, these notes from this open meeting you had, they can tell me, well, it's going to be $20 per sheet. So that's going to be $600. Or they can tell me, you know what, it's too onerous. I don't want to do that. No, thank you. And just not give it to me. Or they could just ignore me forever. And there's really no recourse for members of the public who are seeking that information, which is really unfortunate. Access to public information, to public records and public meetings is a central tenet of democracy and of a healthy democracy. And so in the past years, especially when Senator Ward sponsored it, there was a lot of pushback from state agencies, from localities and counties about the additional burden that this might place on their employees. However, the bill as it was drafted had protections in place to keep it from being overly burdensome, but to still require that government be responsive to its people. It was successfully stonewalled in Senator Ward's final year in the legislature. Last year, Senator Arthur Orr sponsored the bill, and he again reached out to these same stakeholders and didn't get a lot more success in placating their concerns. This year, there are some new folks who are really leading the charge on that. Patricia Todd, who's a former legislator who's now with Jobs to Move America, and the good folks at the ACLU of Alabama, particularly Tish Gotel Falks, who's their legal director, are working on legislation in that regard, and hopefully we'll have something in the works. So those folks would be the ones who are leading the charge this year. Of course, it's a very important issue. It's one we're supportive of. And so hopefully we'll be able to keep you up to date, but definitely check in with them as well if there are people you know and it's something you care about. Frank, I'm not sure what your other question is about. You said, what is the SPLC's position on initiative and referendum for all citizens having greater democracy in Alabama? So unless Jerome knows what that is, if you want to send me a chat, Frank, I'm happy to try to answer it if you can explain it just a little bit more. We don't have any other questions in the Q&A box. So we can, oh yes, okay, great. That's what I thought you might mean, Frank, but I wanted to be sure. So in Alabama, we don't have direct access to ballot initiatives as citizens, right? In Florida and Mississippi might be a bad example because they're kind of upside down with ballot initiatives right now. But in Florida, with enough signatures, you're able to put an issue on the ballot. That is how their rights restoration, so their right to vote for people with felony convictions, ended up on the ballot several years ago. In Alabama, you have to get a bill passed in the legislature to add it to the ballot as a constitutional amendment, which is a much more difficult process, right? You've got to find a bill sponsor, you've got to convince to a large portion of those 140 people in Montgomery to vote for it, because there's a higher threshold for constitutional amendments to pass the legislature than for regular legislation. And so it's really tough. I'll say, Frank, that's not an issue that we've ever been, the lead sponsor on, but it's certainly a topic that we would absolutely be supportive of. So thank you for explaining that a little bit more. I don't know if there are other questions, but let's give it a couple other minutes. And while we wait and see, Jerome, if you want to come back on, are there any issues that we haven't talked about that you're expecting to see this session, or that you're interested that how it'll play out? Maybe not even ones that we're working on.
You would think that after 2 years of Zoom live through the pandemic, and eventually get mute taken care of. Honestly, as you stated before, kind of in the introduction, given that this is an election year session, I really only see kind of the red meat stuff popping up, the things that you mentioned, such as attacks on inclusive education, critical race theory, and the previous issues that we've mentioned. My sense is they're going to try and get in and get out as quickly as possible. As for those of you listening that may not know, they cannot campaign while they're in session. And so the quicker that they're able to get out, works better for them. So in some respects, that's good. We don't anticipate a long, drawn out session, but that also means that everything kind of gets crammed in quickly. And so we've got to stay on top of what's going on as it comes hard, fast, and heavy.
Yeah, absolutely. Last year we had medical marijuana that took up a lot of air at the end of legislative session. This year, the big topics that aren't necessarily ones we discussed or are focused on, but that I'll still mention. We care deeply about the allocation of American Rescue Plan funds and how that process will play out. The legislature has already allocated about $440 million from our American Rescue Plan funds from the federal government, 400 million of that going, as Jerome mentioned earlier, to prison construction. We're still waiting for the United States Treasury's final rule on whether or not that's an allowable expenditure. However, there's still, $1.5 billion left to allocate. And we at SPLC Action Fund and with our coalition partners, folks like Alabama Rise, want to make sure that those funds are allocated in a way that is equitable and that addresses the disparities that exist in Alabama. So that's a lot of money. There will be a lot of people who want some of that money. So that process is going to take up a lot of space during session. And then the latest legislative gossip is that they're going to be back for a round, I don't know what, on gambling and gaming. It's not an issue we work on at all, but it is one that takes up a lot of legislative space. If you followed the legislative session last year, we were right down to the wire talking about gaming with I don't know how many bills on the final day of session, bill versions, which when there are big issues like that taking up space, it certainly provides less opportunity for us to pass our good bills, but in an election year, it also provides less opportunity to pass bad bills. So yes, I don't see any new questions in the chat. So with that, I think we can probably just close things out. I'll say thank you and then throw it over to Jerome, but thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate you, and we hope to see you around this legislative session. Jerome?
Yes, again, thank you everybody for joining. Thank you for participating with your questions. We hope that you will continue to be engaged in this process, as Katie's stated before, kind of tangentially about the importance of open records, staying informed about what's happening in our legislature, what they're doing, what they're attempting to pass is essential to having a functioning democracy, particularly here in Alabama. So stay informed, stay engaged, and we'll continue to do our best to help you be the best citizens that you can be.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.